Hi, David.
I say that.
It's a pleasure to speak with you today. Your work in knowledge cafes has been an inspiration to me and a foundation on which I really felt like there were people who were thinking and practicing and gave me inspiration for taking risks and moving forward in my own work. I consider you seminal leader in knowledge management, seminal thinker in knowledge management, the creator of knowledge cafes and knowledge communities. But I also don't like to identify others. Please, how do you talk about yourself?
I always have a problem with that. I'm never too sure what to call myself. Occasionally I call myself these days a conversationalist. It sounds rather pompous, but it's probably at the heart of what I do. Is to have conversations myself, and to convene conversations. And that's the heart of the Knowledge Cafe. That's my focus. So if you can come up with a nice single word to describe me, share it with me. But maybe for now, conversationalist will do.
Why do you think that's necessary? Why do we need a professional, experienced conversationalist?
In some ways, I'm not too sure that we do. I mean, I think each and every one of us has got the ability to convene conversations, to take a little bit more attention to how we converse. But for some reason, we don't. Are you familiar with the concept of oracy? You come across that term, oracy?
Yeah.
Not many people have. I only came across it myself about 2 years ago. And the term, I think, only goes back to the 60s. We talk all the time in education about numeracy and literacy, the basics of education. So numeracy, the ability to handle and manipulate numbers; literacy, the ability to read and to write; oracy, the ability to talk and the ability to listen, the ability to hold a conversation. And those are the three pillars, if you like, of life, of education. And the oracy one, first of all, the word's only a few years old. Very few people have heard of it. It's one thing we're not taught in schools, which seems kind of really rather strange. Although I don't know about the rest of the world, but in the UK now, there are a number of schools running oracy programs where they're, actually, I was going to say teaching children to have a conversation. I'm not so sure they're teaching in kind of a traditional way, because I think conversations are things that really you can't teach. It's, again, you can set, just like with my cafe, you set the environment, you set the context for the conversation and let people discover what it means to have a good conversation for themselves, to at least to a large degree. Yeah.
You spoke about setting a context and you talked about attention that's necessary.
Mm-hmm.
I think about intent being equal to this idea of attention and listening. What other components are necessary to successful, and I don't know if you would use that word, conversation?
So, to have a successful conversation. As you just say, listening is a big part that gets missed out. It's not something that we're terribly good at. I can't remember who said it. It might have been Stephen Covey, who I first heard it from. We listen with the intent to reply rather than the intent to understand. And the number of times I catch myself doing that in a conversation, in fact, we do it all the time. It's a very deep habit. And so we're waiting for the other person to stop talking so we can tell our little story. And damn it, we should just stop doing that and focus on the conversation. But it is difficult. But in terms of what makes a, actually again, who's the gentleman? Theodore Zeldin, I'm sure you've come across him. He says the kind of conversation he likes is one where we're prepared to emerge a slightly different person. And I just love that quotation. It's a So a conversation is where we're prepared to change. So it's not about debate where we're trying to win. It's not about argument where we're maybe trying to fight. It's about being open to change your minds. You know, it's more about dialogue than anything else. And then I think there are many other aspects to it. I mean, I think a conversation, you've got to enter it into it in good faith. Both sides have got to be open. They've got to be looking to listen and have, you know, kind of a real conversation with the other person. If they're trying to manipulate you or they've got a hidden agenda, to my mind, first of all, it's not a real conversation. And so it's good faith, but also respect. I mean, I know people, I know one or two people, mention their names, who you see it all the time, but they really do not respect the people that they're talking to. And it's just they're not a conversation. I think that there are lots of things that make a conversation not a real conversation. There are other factors as well, like simple power differences. You know, if you're talking to your boss and your boss, well, I guess most times if you're talking to, you know, somebody in authority, it's not a real conversation because you're very, very much aware of the authority that they've got, and you're probably not going to speak your mind to the extent that you might if it was, you know, a mate down the pub, so to speak. So yeah, there's lots of things that make a good conversation, and actually it's kind of interesting because you say good is good and successful. So what makes us? So it's very easy to say what makes a good conversation. I guess it's some, you know, the factors I've just talked about, and maybe something that's enjoyable. What makes a successful conversation? I guess a lot of that's got to do with, you know, did the conversation achieve its aim? And again, this is something which is interesting because a lot of the time we go into conversations without an objective. And I'm not saying we should always have one, because I often think that the most enjoyable conversations are the ones where there isn't an aim. I think the most enjoyable conversations are the ones where the conversation is in charge. The conversation takes you where the conversation wants to take you, not where you want to take it. I mean, it seems a rather strange thing to say, but a lot of the time we don't. And I'm a huge culprit at doing this. You know, I don't focus on what I'm trying to achieve in the conversation, or what the other person's trying to achieve. I'm just enjoying the conversation. But maybe in some contexts that's okay. Makes sense?
I'm enjoying this conversation.
So am I.
You are writing a book on conversational leadership.
Correct, yeah.
So tell me about taking these lessons and what you're thinking about into this realm of leadership, why you're writing this book and what your intent with this book is.
Okay. I started getting really interested. I guess I've been interested in conversation for a long time, but I started getting really interested 15, 16 years ago. And that's where, you know, I designed this thing called a Knowledge Cafe, which is not too dissimilar to the World Cafe, but it does have some key differences. And I started running them in London. They're free events. The conversations were fundamentally around knowledge management. And more by accident than plan, I've ended up running them around the world. I think I've run them in more than 30 countries around the world. And every time I run them, I thoroughly enjoyed them. Running them in other cultures and discovering cultural differences and discovering things about people, I've just thoroughly enjoyed. I guess just learned a lot about people, a lot about culture. And slowly over those 15 years, just got more and more involved and more interested in conversation. And so again, about 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, I thought it's about time I really thoroughly documented the Knowledge Cafe, the process, the case studies, applications, because the Knowledge Cafe, often people think it's just about bringing a bunch of people together to have some interesting conversation and share some knowledge. But I've learned over the years that the cafe can be adapted for many, many different purposes. It could be sharing, it could be discussing risk, it could be looking for opportunities, it could be trying to make sense of a complex issue or problem. I realized there were many, many ways the cafe could be used. So I started out writing about the cafe and the principles and I say the applications, etc. But as I got into it, it kept broadening. I wanted to write about the question you just asked, what makes a real conversation, what makes a good conversation, what makes a successful conversation. I wanted to write about other conversational methods like after action reviews and peer assists, everything conversational, but everything fundamentally face-to-face conversation. So I started to write about that. And this was all offline. I was doing this in a Word document, and I didn't find it terribly a very good either thinking mechanism to do it in one big Word document. So I thought, right, let's. I didn't really want to write a book, a traditional book. So I thought, let's create a website that was blog-like, that looked and felt like a cross between a blog and a book. So I don't call my website a book. I call it a book. So it's a cross between a blog and a book. And the great thing about that is that of course I can embed video, I can embed slide presentations, I can embed photos. It's multimedia, but also like now we're having a conversation. I've got my pen and pencil here. If anything amazing comes out of this conversation, which I'm sure it will, I'll make a note either now or later. And maybe in 30 minutes time, I will update my book. Because I often think a book or an email or a document is where knowledge goes to die. It's a graveyard. What I like about the book, if you like, is that it's alive. I can update it, and I do. I update it every single day. So I started to pull that together. But it was, again, the book is as much a thinking tool or structuring tool as it is anything else. And as I start to write it, I'm not starting with a structure. Maybe unlike other people, I didn't try to put a structure together. I just tried to write a number of, if you like, traditional blog posts, and then try to sort it, categorize it, tag it, structure it, so that it had some coherence. And as I was doing this, there was one question that was on my mind all the time, and I couldn't shake it off. And the question was basically, why do you feel, David, why do you feel conversation is so important? And there are lots of obvious reasons. We know intuitively almost that we need to communicate better. We need to collaborate better. I think so many of the troubles, in our personal lives, in business world, in society, is poor communication, misunderstanding. So there's lots of good reasons for taking conversation more seriously. But I kept wondering, there seemed to be something a little deeper. And this isn't everything, but to me, it's a big part of it. It's the major part of it. I realized that if I look back over 50 years of my adulthood, the world has become incredibly more connected. Not just Facebook, not just the internet, but our financial system, our global financial system, our supply chains, our distribution channels. It's a very, very hyper-connected world. And with that hyper-connectivity comes increased complexity. And one of the things about complexity is that inherently, you cannot predict the future. The future, not that we were terribly good at it in the past, but as things become more and more complex, it becomes more and more difficult to predict the future and control things. And I started to realize and feel that so many of the problems that we face in the world were to do with that complexity and not understanding that complexity. And really, one of the few ways we had to get our heads around the complexity is to bring a diverse group of people together to talk about the issues, and to do that through conversation. And so that's how, in fact, that's how the book started to take shape, because I'd written the sort of centerpiece about conversation. I thought, okay, now I'm going to go back and figure out maybe what I should have done in the first place is the purpose of this. And that's what I started to do. So there were two pieces to this. One, first of all, was recognizing the need for more conversation to better make sense of a complex world. Because now one CEO or one elite strategy team really didn't have the ability to do that. Things were just too complex, too much information. You needed more people. And secondly, was the leadership piece emerged from this. And it's kind of tied into what I've just been saying. One heroic leader does not have the capability to lead anymore. We all, each and every one of us in our own domains, needs to lead. I'm just trying to think who it is now. Somebody said I've got the quotation, I've just forgotten the guy's name. Who is it? It's Daniel Goleman. He said something along the lines that, what did he say? Everybody who has influence is a leader. If you think about it, we all have influence, and it just seems to me that a lot of us maybe don't consciously see ourselves as a leader. We don't consciously leverage that influence. But again, what do good leaders do in terms of influencing the world or people around them? Again, they do it fundamentally through conversation. So hence this term conversational leadership. It's not just about initiating the conversations that need to be had, but that's a big part of it. It's, there's a little bit more to it than that. I kind of rambled away there. I hope that made some sense. Yeah.
It's extraordinary. The focus on complexity and complex systems and complex systems theory. Do you meet leaders who say, no, things are already too complex. The last thing I want is to have a conversation that's only going to further complexify things?
I've never heard anyone say that, but that just seems rather crazy to me. It's the only way you're going to make any sense of it. I mean, the one thing I do hear often said is, well, we need to simplify. We need to simplify complexity, and to some degree, you can, but by and large, the world is sufficiently complex today that most real problems you cannot simplify them. You just need to make better sense of the world. I mean, I've been hugely influenced by Dave Snowden and his work, and the likes of Ralph Stacey and Patricia Shaw, and there are a few people out there who really understand what this is all about. What's interesting, I must find the video. I saw somebody giving a talk about complexity to a large group of, I think, mainly CEOs or VPs. They were senior managers, and he simply asked. He said, "Do you understand the difference between a complicated system and a complex system?" And I think he even gave an example. You know, there's a Airbus A380 was complicated. You know, you could take it apart, you could put it back together again. And a complex system was, say, the world financial system. Then he asked them to give examples themselves, and they couldn't. They really didn't understand the difference. And these were very senior people. And I realized that that's one of the problems that we face if nothing else, forget the conversation. Just if more people understood what complexity was about, and the fact that they had to take a somewhat different approach to the problems and issues that we face, if they're working in the complex domain. That itself would be a huge step forward. And there are other little things going on. Have you heard of chatty cafes? Again, it's a UK phenomenon. I think it was a young woman, and I think married with a young child, and she used to go to local cafe, with her baby son or whatever, and didn't have anyone to talk to. So she convinced the owner to put signs on some of the tables, which basically said, if you sit at this table, then you're prepared to talk to a stranger. And she set up a little movement, and there were, I think there were hundreds of cafes in the UK, including the Costa coffee chain, have done it. They're designated chatty cafes, and there's just certain tables in those coffee houses where, if you're lonely, you can go and sit and have a conversation with a stranger. And I think that's lovely. I think it's an interesting thing about conversation. I mean, here am I kind of more focused on how we can use conversation to create a better world, or maybe how we can use conversation in business. And that's the kind of the one end of the spectrum. At the end of the spectrum is the conversation you might have with a stranger in a cafe. We've also had some interesting things go on in London, on our London Underground, our London Tube. Somebody about 2 years ago created a little badge that basically said something along the lines, talk to me. So when they were on the tube, if they were sitting there, they're basically saying, anyone can approach me on the tube and talk to me. But there was an anti-movement. Somebody else created a little badge that said, under no circumstances do I want to talk to anybody on the tube. And I think what was interesting about that, that little kind of clash promoted a lot of conversation and reflection and insight in itself as to maybe why people didn't want to talk to strangers.
It's a conversation revolution, David.
Yeah, let's get out there.